to fill in those of you who aren't already familiar with aspects I'm going to talk about, and many of you are, many of you have heard some of this before. And having done that, I'm then going to go on to talk about the changing character of configuration of settlement and activity on the site. I am not going to talk about its broader landscape context. I'm not going to talk about its broader place in networks of power, both of which I could be here all day doing that, and both of those topics will be considered subsequent seminars. Nor am I going to get into the idea of royal landscapes, which I don't believe in. What I will say straight away is I think this is a symptom, or it is an expression of extensive lordship, which is not necessarily the same thing at all. So I think we need to pull back from some of our more specific interpretations and I would say problematise or theoritise the data more. Anyway, the other thing I want to do is get the legal stuff out of the way first. This talk comes absolutely guaranteed to be compliant with the University of Reading External Speaker Code of Conduct.
Glad to hear it.
So I will not now be dissing anybody, nor will I be fundraising for ISIS. The modern civil parish of Rendlesham, if we can locate the site, lies on the east side of the River Deben in southeast Suffolk, about 6 kilometres northeast of the obscure Barrow Cemetery at Sutton Hoo. The modern parish incorporates a range of terrains that in the past provided a range of resources. So we have marsh or water meadow in the valley bottom, agricultural soils on the gentle valley slopes, and interfluves which are now intensively cultivated, but which in the past were probably heathland and sheep walk. And the site sits within the sandlings of southeast Suffolk, a region of subdued topography and light sandy soils dissected by estuarine rivers flowing into the North Sea. And it's been argued that this sandlings region, dubbed the Sandlings Province by Martin Carver, formed the territorial focus of East Anglian royal power in the 7th century. Now, we are largely, I think, presuming that what we're looking at are sites of royal residence. Rendlesham is one of the few where there is actually a royal connection, because Rendlesham is mentioned by Bede, but it's not mentioned as the site of royal residence, although we might infer that. It's mentioned as the East Anglian Vicus Regius, or royal settlement, where King Swithelm of the East Saxons was baptised under the aegis of the then king of the East Angles in the late 650s or the early 660s. The work that I'm going to talk about was undertaken as part of a larger field survey between 2008 and 2014. The survey area is shown, these are the red fields on this map. It covers about 150 hectares. It forms a transect about 3 kilometres north-south along the east side of the Deben Valley and about 1.25 kilometres east-west across the grain of the landscape, which coincidentally gives us a sample area large enough to be sure that the patterns of presence, absence and clustering of finds are real, and to examine how patterns of activity, finds, retrieval vary across the grain of the landscape. The main survey method that we're talking about here has been systematic surface collection with metal detectors, which aimed for 100% coverage of that 150 hectares. All the survey units shown here have been surveyed at least twice. The location of all finds that predate 1650, including pottery and flint, as well as metal items, have been recorded using handheld GPS, and all the finds are integrated on a Microsoft Access database linked to a project GIS in MapInfo, which allows the integration of a range of data sets. And I should emphasise that everything recovered comes from the top 15 centimetres or so of the plough soil and has long since been removed from its stratigraphic context by past agriculture. And the survey area is almost entirely modern agricultural land. There's one tiny area of pasture which was previously arable land within it. The database holds records of 3,946 items which date from the Neolithic to the early modern. So what the survey here has identified, and this slide shows all the find spots of that near 4,000 objects. What we've identified here is a very complex pattern of activity and settlement from prehistory right through to the 21st century. And of the material that can be closely dated, about 27% of the items are Anglo-Saxon, 5th to 11th centuries. This compares with only 5% of Anglo-Saxon items from the background, the Suffolk background, as represented by finds reported through the Portal Antiquities the Portal Antiquities scheme. A majority of this Anglo-Saxon material from Rendlesham is of the 5th to 8th centuries, and therefore this massive overrepresentation indicates very significant activity at this place during that time. And this slide shows the distribution of the 5th to 11th century finds, which does suggest a concentration activity over an area of about 50 hectares during the period of the 5th to the 8th centuries. And although the majority of our finds are of this early period, the 5th to the 8th centuries, we do have evidence for continuing occupation up to the 11th century and beyond from both metalwork finds and pottery. Keep your eye on the dotted rectangle, because that's the area of the dotted rectangle. We've undertaken magnetometry and detailed topographic survey over 46 hectares to investigate the core area of Anglo-Saxon activity as it's indicated by the metal detecting results. And again, the magnetometry results show an extensive palimpsest of enclosures, boundaries and settlement features, which we know to represent activity from late prehistory to the 20th century. We have undertaken some ground truthing, some verification of the results. Selected features identified by magnetometry were targeted during field evaluation in 2013 and 2014. So the little red things are our evaluation trenches in these two fields. And the results confirmed the accuracy of the magnetometry and provided information on the preservation, character, date and potential of the buried archaeology that allows us to be more confident about interpreting the wider scale geophysics data set. And it also provided us with faunal and environmental samples and radiocarbon dates. So we have Grubenhäuser, we have rubbish pits, we have ploughed out cremations where we thought there were burials and cremations, and we have a major linear feature filled with and overlain by very, very rich midden deposits stuffed full of animal bone with a huge preponderance of cattle and of young animals as well, which accumulated here probably during the later 6th and the 7th centuries. Now, transcription of aerial photography has been undertaken for the site, and in 2015, what appears to be the foundations of a rectangular timber building, about 23 metres long by 9.5 metres wide, were identified. The interpretation of this, plotted out here, is not certain, but it's a decent candidate for a major Anglo-Saxon rectangular building. And the lady from the NMP who has plotted this from a combination of poor results on aerial photography plus geophysics thinks she can see more than one phase, perhaps in this structure. But we've not intervened. That's simply from aerial photography and remote sensing data. We have evidence for metalworking from the site, evidence for non-ferrous metalworking in the 6th and 7th centuries, which includes scrap metal, including gold, lead models for making moulds, globules and other melted metals spilled during casting, casting sprues and unfinished items discarded after casting. Precious metal scrap and precious metal melt, the lead model for a sword ring and an unfinished belt or harness mount in style 2 shown here all point to manufacture for higher status patrons. But we've also got plain copper alloy dress pins, buckles and bag catches, both finished and unfinished examples, which point to more everyday production. Now, the precise scale and organisation of metalworking here and the social position of the craft workers remain open questions. But the fact that we've got finished and unfinished items of exactly the same type indicate that at least some of the items worn and used by people at Rendlesham were being made there. And the relatively large numbers of these bag catches, so-called bag or box catches, types which are known from contemporary 7th century burials, but which are relatively rare. They're not the most massively common type. The fact that we've really got quite a lot of these does suggest that we may have production here for a wider population than just the permanent inhabitants of this settlement. We have evidence for interregional contacts, including brooch types that are rare in England and best paralleled from Frankish Gaul, which suggest a community with interregional social and cultural contacts from at least the early to middle 6th century, actually probably the later 5th. The non-local material of the later 6th and 7th centuries includes Frankish gold coinage, elements of hanging bowls from northern or western Britain, and fragments of Byzantine copper alloy vessels from the eastern Mediterranean. And Rendlesham also has an exceptionally large assemblage of 6th to 8th century coins. The database records 25 early gold coins of about 580 to 670, majority Merovingian tremeces, including 6 early English gold shillings. We have 168 shatters of between about 675 and 750. And one of the points about this is that both the gold coins and the shatters are found across the settlement area with no significant clustering and very similar distributions. So there's the distribution of the gold, there's the distribution of the shatters, and they cannot therefore be explained as ploughed out hoards. They must represent continuous loss through transactions. So Rendlesham was a place to which coin was flowing disproportionately from at least the later 6th to the earlier 8th centuries. And we believe, because of this similarity of patterning and the fact that we've got a lot of unmounted gold coins, that it would appear that the gold coinage was circulating as currency, albeit socially restricted currency, not just as bullion or as a raw material for the jeweller. And we have some evidence to corroborate this in the form of coin weights marked with contemporary Byzantine denominations, also cut coins, 2 weight-adapted coins, blanks and ingots, and what may be a gilded silver forgery of a Merovingian tremesis. You take these together and they suggest a system in which the gold coins are recognised as units of account that might need to be checked for weight and fineness, but where payments might also be made in equivalent weights of uncoined bullion. And of course the socially restricted circulation of gold currency helps provide a monetary context for high-value, long-distance exchange, the sort of thing we see in the presence of the East Mediterranean cast bronze vessels. And it also helps to define the earlier context in which the deeper monetization developed that we see in the uptake of the silver coinages from the later 7th century. Now, this Merovingian gold coinage encapsulates the link between the acquisition of portable wealth, the consumption of portable wealth, and the display of portable wealth, and long-distance communication. And these are contacts that can only be explained if this settlement served as an elite social group. And confirmation that we have an elite presence here from the early or middle 6th centuries at least, if not before, comes from high-quality dress jewellery, weapon fittings and harness fittings, of which this slide shows a selection. And these items include 2 gold bracelets of the early to middle 6th century that are items which, when found elsewhere in England, even singly, are considered indicative in themselves of an elite status. What I have to stress, though, of course, is that most items from Rendlesham are unostentatious and sometimes indeed unidentifiable copper alloy objects, and that the material speaks of a broad social range at this site. And I would say that's probably between a permanent population and a peripatetic elite presence. And that, in a nutshell, is why we characterise this extensive settlement at the moment as a polyfocal central place complex, because it displays these characteristics. Right, chronology and site sequence. Although we're working primarily with plough soil finds and palimpsests of features revealed by remote sensing and aerial photography, we do actually have a range of chronological tools or indicators of considerable precision and of considerable potential if we can integrate them. So the coins, obviously they're quite good. Chronologically, the metalwork, fine metalwork's quite good. There are relative sequences of features that you can at least model from remote sensing aerial photography. There are other spatial relationships which you can use to model development, and we do have some radiocarbon dates, not a massive number, but some radiocarbon dates from some of the excavated features. One of the points to stress is there is a significant late Roman element to the assemblage from Rendlesham, which is untypical of this part of England. And this includes the latest coinage to reach Britain, and it includes late military or official belt fittings. This does appear to suggest an official establishment here from the later 4th century, and the presence of clipped siliquae in our sample might indicate the exercise of some authority into the 5th century. There is also evidence for what would conventionally be considered a culturally Germanic presence with a high status element, particularly this gilded silver material, with a high status element from the 2nd quarter or middle of the 5th century. And this may suggest no break in activity from the later 4th century, and that the settlement's exceptional character in the 6th to 8th centuries was rooted in its earlier status under the late Roman Empire. A word or two about the site's topography. To the south, we have this. This is a flat promontory, a hanging promontory at about 10 metres ordnance datum, with a steep slope down, or a steepish slope down to the floodplain. To the north and east, across the valley of a little tributary stream into the River Deben, we have these slopes rising to the interfluve, and you can see how our finds relate to that topography. North and east of the stream, our evaluation suggests that a very high proportion of these macular features, or blobs, on the geophysics are early to middle Anglo-Saxon Grubenhäuser and pits, extending over at least 8 hectares, and if we factor in the more recent aerial photography transcription, also extending down here, probably in the area of 10 to 14 or 15 hectares. It's similar to the spread of Grubenhäuser at Mucking, for instance, or at West Heatherton, and as at such sites, I think there are almost certainly ground-level timber buildings here whose earth-fast foundations, whether they are post holes or narrow trenches, are simply unlikely to have been detected by our geophysics. Within this area, we have concentrations, or a concentration of 5th and 6th century dress accessories and decorated pottery in the plough soil, which indicate burials. Difficult to argue that they can indicate anything else, both furnished inhumations and urn cremations, and of course the presence of cremations has been confirmed where we expected them by excavation. And we have a cluster of finds indicative of non-ferrous metalworking here, suggesting that we do have a metalworking area or a workshop in the 6th and 7th centuries. This is the area where there's the probable or possible hall. This is also an area where there is a massive concentration of high status metalwork of the 6th and 7th centuries, and if there is a high status residence core to this complex, that's where we think it is. Now, both the pattern of coin loss and the profile of the chronological profile of other metalwork finds shows a dramatic fall off from the early 8th century, between 700 and 720, suggesting that there was a significant change in status of the site and intensity of activity and character activity here at that time. And this is mirrored in the finds distributions, which suggest a decline in the area of settlement. So the distribution of the finds of the 5th to the 8th centuries, shown here, appears to represent activity across the entire 50 hectares, although of course within that there are going to be changes of focus density over time. But when we look at the distribution of 9th to 11th century finds, we can see it's very much more restricted and really rather sparser, with only 2 areas here and here, which might indicate settlement. Also, from the middle of the 8th century, the material culture signature looks like that of a normal farming settlement. There's nothing unusual about it against the regional background at all. What I should stress, though, is there's no evidence for a break in occupation. There are changes in spatial character and configuration, but settlement continues in the immediate vicinity to the 11th century and thereafter to the present day. And we believe, actually, we have some direct archaeological evidence of this, that there was, in the 10th and 11th centuries, an aggregation of settlement around the medieval and post-medieval green here. So what we've got here is a favoured location in the landscape, and the major complex of the 6th to 8th centuries is an episode in a much longer term sequence of settlement and activity. What I don't think we have is any evidence that this was a place where the prehistoric landscape somehow governed its importance, insofar as we've got any indications of an inherited landscape or something already there which dictated what developed. It's from the late 4th century. There's the proximity of the Church of St Gregory to the high status core is intriguing, and this is the area of that what we think is the high status core. There is the medieval church, the current church building. It's medieval fabric, 13th or 14th century. But it's unusual, and it's possibly early dedication to St Gregory the Great might suggest it's on the site of a 7th century church. And a lot of people have made this case. It does, though, remain an open question. That church site may have a close and direct connection with the 7th century settlement, and indeed to the place of King Swithelm's baptism. But we have to consider as well that the first church on the site may have been elsewhere, or if it was on this site, it may have been a later foundation. This then is our spatial model, current spatial model of what we call the central place complex at Rendlesham at its height from the late 6th century to the early 8th century. We propose a high status residence core with associated metalworking, waste disposal from feasting and so on and so forth on this hanging promontory, with agricultural and service settlement here and also burials. And it can be placed within a context of other smaller scale settlement and burial up and down the Deben Valley. We suggest that this whole complex, indicated by the dotted line, might be thought of as a vicus regius, the term which is used to describe it in Bede, in the sense of an extensive settlement embodying a range of functions, rights and obligations under the umbrella of lordship, or possibly more than one lordship. And that within this there may have been a villa regalis in the sense of a discrete elite residence and administrative establishment, although there is no record of that. But if there were such a thing, then we say villa regalis, vicus regius. Now, I should emphasise just how extensive the Rendlesham complex is. So this slide shows the excavated hall arrays at other elite settlements to scale against the settlement complex at Rendlesham. And you can see that Rendlesham is huge when you look at the comparison. And the identification of a long-lived central place complex on this scale is something new in the archaeology of early to Middle Anglo-Saxon England. And as such, it does rather invite comparison with sites in Denmark and southern Sweden, such as Guma and Upokra. But it also needs to be seen, I think, against the economic and political geographies of the near Channel and the North Sea coasts, and in particular the emergence of polyfocal central places in North Francia. Not identical by any means, but conceptually perhaps similar. And therefore this begins to align southeast England with much broader contemporary trajectories of economic and political development, both within and without the former provinces of the Roman Empire. But although Rendlesham is currently unique in the archaeological record of England in its size, wealth, longevity and complexity, I'm not convinced that it will remain so. Other sites simply haven't been investigated on this scale or with the same array of extensive approaches. We know that Hatton Rock, Millfield and Sutton Courtenay, for example, are all components of more extensive settlement landscapes, and as we've seen at Sutton Courtenay, this includes an area of Grubenhäuser and probably timber buildings some 300 to 400 metres north of the whole complex. And as we've also seen, limited metal detecting suggests that there was an activity profile at Sutton Courtenay quite similar to that at Rendlesham. So when we look at the broader landscape of activity at Sutton Courtenay, shown here, from Helena's publication, it is more nearly comparable to that at Rendlesham, although Rendlesham evidently does extend over a much, much larger area. So, just the final things. I'd have to make the point this is work in progress. It's a collaborative project, and we must acknowledge with thanks everybody who has been involved, shown here, especially the four metal detectorists, Rob, Roy, Terry and Alan, without whom we wouldn't have any of this. We must acknowledge the tremendous support from the landowner and farmer for their active encouragement, and from the funding bodies who've helped us out, and from the many colleagues who've given their time to the project at no cost or little cost. And if you want to know more, then we have recent and imminent publications, a website, and there is a day conference to present the results of the project to as large a public audience as we can this September. At which the results will be presented and research priorities for the future will be discussed. So I hope that was useful. Cheers.